Imagine hearing a question you were never meant to ask. What would drive a father to betray his own blood? What kind of hunger could make a man take what was destined for his son and bind it to himself in the shadow of God's altar? The year was whispered, but never spoken aloud. The place, a quiet corner of America where nothing was supposed to happen. And yet it did. A marriage that broke not only the law of men, but the law of nature itself. Why was this event buried? Why were families silenced, records altered, and entire communities told to forget? Tonight we uncover the story that was never meant to be told. A story from 1888 Arkansas, where a forbidden union left behind a stain no time could wash away. The year was 1888, and Arkansas was still a land in transition, caught between the old world of the frontier and the new world that was slowly creeping in with railroads, industry, and a sense of order. It was a place where the echoes of the Civil War still lingered in hushed conversations and bitter glances across church aisles. Families carried reputations like heirlooms, guarded fiercely because they defined not only who a man was, but how his children and grandchildren would be remembered. Honor was currency. Respectability was survival. In such a world, the smallest whisper of scandal could ruin a family for generations. And in 1888, scandal was a shadow that crept quickly, spreading faster than the trains that crossed the land. Arkansas in those years was a place of contrasts. Town squares bustled with gossip and barter, while just beyond the outskirts, dirt roads led to isolated farms where families lived hard, self-reliant lives. The land was fertile, but life was punishing, with storms, floods, and droughts always threatening to undo months of labor. Religion was both the glue and the chain, binding communities together with Sunday sermons while also dictating every moral boundary. The pulpit's voice was final, its authority often seen as greater than the courthouse. But beneath that veneer of piety, the same human flaws, lust, jealousy, pride, festered in the silence. The story we now turn to was rooted in this soil, shaped by a culture where men held unquestioned authority and women were treated more like possessions than individuals. Marriage itself was often less about love and more about alliances, property, and family survival. To marry well was to secure land, wealth, or influence. To marry poorly could mean a family's slow decline. This was the reality of rural Arkansas at the end of the 19th century. Yet even within these harsh rules, there were boundaries one was not supposed to cross. A father's role was clear: protector, provider, the moral leader of the family. To betray those duties was not only to harm his household, but to disrupt the fragile balance of the entire community. Against this backdrop, the year 1888 stood as more than just a marker of time. It was a threshold year, one in which America as a whole was transforming, yet rural Arkansas clung to its traditions with a grip of iron. The very idea of what happened here was unthinkable in such a climate. This was not merely a matter of impropriety or a lapse in judgment. It was an act so disturbing it fractured every social law, written and unwritten. It was a betrayal that called into question the sanctity of the family itself, and by extension, the moral authority of the community that surrounded it. The town itself was small enough that everyone knew each other's business, but large enough that secrets could fester in dark corners. Wooden houses lined the dusty streets, their porches sagging under the weight of rocking chairs and quiet eyes that noticed more than they let on. Every wedding, every death, every scandal was a collective event, discussed not just in kitchens, but in the echoing wooden pews of the church where reputations were whispered into permanence. In this world, the line between public and private barely existed, and yet when something too monstrous to comprehend occurred, it was often swallowed by silence. Silence was the community's shield, the way it preserved itself from shame. In 1888, Arkansas was not merely a setting. It was a crucible. The harsh environment demanded resilience. Families leaned on each other for survival, yet beneath that dependence lay the constant threat of betrayal. A man's authority was both his weapon and his curse. His reputation could carry him through disputes, but if that reputation crumbled, there was no rebuilding it. Communities remembered. They remembered for decades, sometimes centuries. Stories passed from one generation to another like poisoned heirlooms. But some stories, the ones too unbearable, were pushed down, whispered only in fragments. They became ghost stories, half-remembered tales that no one dared put into writing. The year also mattered for another reason. By 1888, America was entering a period of moral tightening. The temperance movement was growing. Women were beginning to whisper about suffrage, and communities were clinging harder than ever to the idea of moral purity. The stricter the codes became, the more scandalous this particular event appeared. A father was not just any man. He represented the pillar of his household. To see that pillar rot from within was to confront something no community wanted to acknowledge: that corruption did not only arrive from the outside world, but could grow in their own homes, in their own bloodlines. The rhythms of life in Arkansas at the time only heightened the shock of what occurred. People woke before dawn to tend to livestock. Women worked endlessly with their hands, sewing, cooking, raising children, and children were raised in rigid obedience. Every life was intertwined with the seasons, with planting and harvest, with floods and droughts. The church calendar dictated festivals, marriages, and funerals. For something so unnatural as a father taking his son's bride, there was no place in that calendar, no scripture to neatly explain it, no ritual to contain it. It was not merely forbidden, it was unspeakable, and yet it happened. The year fixes the moment in history, but it also locks it into a time when records were inconsistent, when rural events often vanished unless someone fought to preserve them. That is what makes this story so chilling. It was not a tale passed down proudly, but one buried in shame. When we look back to 1888 Arkansas, we are not just tracing dates on a calendar. We are excavating the very bones of a world that struggled to reconcile its ideals with its darkest failures. To imagine the people of that year is to see them with hardened hands, weathered faces, and eyes that rarely met yours too long, lest secrets slip through. It is to walk down roads lined with oak trees, their branches arching overhead like the ribs of a cathedral, and feel the heavy silence pressing down. It is to hear hymns sung on Sunday, voices trembling not with joy, but with a desperate need for order, in a world where chaos always waited just beyond the horizon. And within that silence, within those trembling voices, the year 1888 bore witness to a secret so unbearable that it was pushed out of sight, where it would remain until fragments of truth clawed their way back to the surface. The family at the center of this dark tale was not unlike many others that dotted the Arkansas countryside in the late 19th century. From the outside, they appeared ordinary, humble in possessions but respectable in the eyes of neighbors, bound by the unyielding routines of farm life. The patriarch of the family was a man hardened by time and circumstance, a figure whose authority stretched from his household to the small stretch of land he oversaw. He had lived long enough to see the nation torn apart by civil war and sewn back together with uneven stitches. That experience alone had shaped him into someone who believed in control above all else, control of his land, his family, and his reputation. He was not a man one easily contradicted. To his neighbors he might have appeared stern but dependable, the sort of man whose handshake was as binding as a signed contract. But within his home, his authority was not just law, it was absolute. Fathers in that era were rarely questioned, and when they were, the punishment could be swift and brutal. A glance from him could silence a child, and his word could settle disputes before they left the dinner table. It was into this atmosphere that his son was raised, always under the heavy shadow of a man who seemed larger than life. The son himself was young, not yet hardened by years of labor, and he carried the quiet eagerness of someone ready to step into his own adulthood. For him, marriage represented not only love but independence. A wife meant a household, a chance to escape the suffocating weight of his father's rule. His intended bride was the path toward freedom, a future that finally belonged to him rather than to the man whose expectations loomed over every choice he made. His affection for her was genuine, spoken about in hushed tones between friends, and noticed by those who had seen the two walking together after Sunday service. Their pairing seemed certain, and in a community where gossip was both pastime and judgment, it was widely understood that the young man and the young woman would soon bind their lives together. The young woman stood at the center of this storm, though she could not have known what awaited her. She was described as modest, reserved, the sort of woman who kept her eyes lowered and her words measured. In a society that prized obedience and silence in women, she seemed to fit the mold perfectly. But her future, like so many others of her sex, was not hers to shape. In those days, marriage was not about her choice. It was about what her union could bring to the families involved. She was a daughter to be given, a wife to be claimed, a mother to be expected. What she desired mattered little when the weight of men's decisions pressed down upon her life. It was this fragile balance of a father's authority, a son's hope, and a woman's fate that set the stage for what was to come. In ordinary circumstances, the father's role would have been to bless his son's union, to hand down not only permission but pride in seeing his lineage continue. Instead, something shifted. Perhaps it was jealousy, perhaps pride, or perhaps the simple, cruel intoxication of power. The father, who should have stood as protector and guide, saw in the young woman not just his son's future, but his own chance at renewal. To take her as his own would mean more than stealing his son's bride. It would mean asserting once more that his will was untouchable, that even the natural order of family bowed beneath his command. For the son, this betrayal was unimaginable. His entire life had been built on obedience to the man who now turned against him in the most personal way possible. To lose a bride to another man was humiliation enough. To lose her to his own father was something beyond words, a wound that pierced not only the heart, but the very core of his identity. A son could rebel against a father, yes, but to do so was to invite exile, ruin, or even violence. In 1888 Arkansas, there was little room for defiance. The weight of tradition and religion crushed down any thought of open rebellion. And so, he endured, his shame carried quietly, his silence forced upon him by the very same authority that had taken everything from him. The young woman's position was even more precarious. Her silence in the record speaks louder than any testimony might have. Did she consent to this arrangement, or was she pressured into it with the cold inevitability of a society where her choices meant nothing? Perhaps she feared the father's power, or perhaps her own family encouraged the match, blinded by the father's influence or wealth. In such a world, a woman's resistance was not always recorded. It was often erased. Whatever her private thoughts, history offers us only her absence, the empty space where her voice should have been. Neighbors, of course, noticed. Communities in those days were tight-knit, every movement observed, every change in routine marked by whispers. Some must have shaken their heads in disgust, while others chose silence, unwilling to challenge a man whose reputation made him untouchable. Gossip would have flown like dust across the fields, whispered in kitchens, muttered in church pews, but never spoken loudly enough to bring consequence. The family's name may have carried the weight to withstand scandal, at least outwardly, but the stain would never truly wash away. And so, the family fractured in ways no one could openly acknowledge. The father stood triumphant, cloaked in the false righteousness of his own power. The son wandered in humiliation, his future ripped away. The young woman disappeared into her role as wife, her identity consumed by the man she had married under such disturbing circumstances. Together they became the embodiment of everything that could go wrong when authority turned inward, when protection twisted into possession, and when silence became the community's weapon of choice. The family itself became a mirror held up to Arkansas in that era, stern, God-fearing, obsessed with appearances, yet deeply vulnerable to the rot that came from within. In a world where fathers ruled without question, what happened when that rule became corruption? What happened when loyalty was not rewarded but betrayed? These questions linger, long after the names of the family have been lost, long after the scandal was pushed out of sight. The family that once appeared ordinary became infamous in whispers, remembered not for their land or their labor, but for a union that defied every natural law. The forbidden marriage did not happen in a storm of sudden violence, but in the slow, deliberate erosion of boundaries that should never have been crossed. The son's courtship of the young woman had been open enough, the kind of predictable match that the community expected. They were seen together after services, their names mentioned side by side in conversations, and for a time there seemed to be no question that a union between them would be the next step. The preparations spoken in whispers carried with them the certainty of tradition. But tradition can be fragile, and in this case, it was shattered in a way that stunned even the most hardened gossip in the town. The father's pursuit of his son's intended was not an act of passion in the way stories of forbidden love are often told. It was cold, deliberate, and carefully orchestrated. He began to take notice of her not as his son's bride-to-be, but as a woman whose presence could serve his own needs. Age weighed on him. His body, though still strong, carried the heaviness of years, and his authority, while respected, no longer held the same aura of unchallengeable power it once had. The world around him was shifting, new generations rising, new ideas of independence creeping in, and perhaps he felt the tightening of time. To claim her as his own was to seize something youthful, to reassert dominance not only over his family but over the very order of things. In communities like theirs, the process of marriage was woven with both religious and social obligations. A union was supposed to reflect the will of families, the blessing of the church, and the expectations of society. For the father to step into the place of his son was to violate every one of those threads. And yet he moved forward with an audacity that suggested he believed himself untouchable. He sought out the preacher, arranged for the ceremony, and stood at the altar with a composure that masked the enormity of what he was doing. Those who attended would later remember the atmosphere as strained, as though the walls of the church itself resisted the words being spoken within. For the son, watching his father take his place must have been a moment of unbearable torment. To see the woman he loved, the woman he had believed was meant for him, standing beside the figure he could never escape. It was not just a theft of affection, but a theft of destiny. In a world where inheritance and lineage defined a man's future, to lose his bride to his father was to lose everything at once: love, dignity, and the chance to build a household of his own. He became a shadow within his own family, erased by the very man who had brought him into the world. The young woman's role in the ceremony remains a haunting mystery. Did she speak the vows willingly, or were her words drawn out under pressure, her silence a sign of resignation rather than consent? The records are silent, the testimonies vague, leaving us only with the image of her standing beside the patriarch, her life redirected by forces far greater than her own will. Perhaps she believed resistance was futile, or perhaps she was convinced that submission was the only way to survive in a society where women had so little power. Whatever the case, once the vows were spoken, her fate was sealed, and there would be no turning back. The community's reaction was a mix of shock, revulsion, and uneasy silence. On one hand, the act was a violation of every moral and social code that bound them together. On the other, challenging the father directly could bring ruin. His position, his reputation, and his sheer force of presence kept others from intervening. Instead, they whispered behind closed doors, trading fragments of outrage like contraband. In the pews on Sunday mornings, they avoided meeting each other's eyes, their hymns sung louder than usual to drown out the weight of what they could not speak. The preacher himself, having presided over the union, bore the uneasy stain of complicity, his authority compromised by the very words he had uttered in the name of God. The forbidden marriage was more than a scandal. It was a kind of ritual desecration, the inversion of roles that society depended on. The father was meant to be the figure who passed down wisdom, who safeguarded the honor of his son, who ensured the stability of the household. By taking his son's bride, he upended those expectations and left behind a wound that could not be healed. His home became a place of tension, where silence replaced conversation, and where the son's presence was a reminder of the betrayal that had taken place. Such a marriage also carried with it legal ambiguities. While the law did not explicitly forbid a man from marrying the woman promised to his son, it was understood to be an abomination against natural law. Marriage in that era was still considered a contract as much as a sacrament, and contracts could be manipulated by those who understood their loopholes. By making the union official, the father cloaked his transgression in legality, ensuring that no one could openly challenge him without appearing to oppose the sanctity of marriage itself. It was a twisted form of protection, shielding his betrayal with the very institution it defiled. Over time, the consequences of the forbidden marriage rippled outward. The son carried his humiliation quietly, a living reminder to the community of what had been done. Some accounts suggest he left the family home, drifting in search of work, his name spoken with pity in hushed tones. Others claim he remained, his silence forced upon him by dependency and the crushing weight of obedience. Whatever path he chose, his life was marked by the event, his future eclipsed by the shadow of his father's act. The young woman's story is harder to trace. She lived as a wife, her identity reshaped by the marriage, but little else is known. Did she bear children? Did she find any semblance of peace within the walls of a household built on betrayal? The silence of the record suggests that whatever her experiences, they were not ones the community wished to preserve. Her name, once tied to hope and the possibility of a conventional life, faded into obscurity, leaving only the unsettling memory of her place in a union that should never have been. The forbidden marriage stood as a stain upon the community, a reminder that even in the most tightly controlled societies, the boundaries of morality could be breached. It was a story too disturbing to be told openly, too corrosive to be written into official histories. And yet, in the quiet spaces between gossip and memory, it survived, passed down in fragments, a cautionary tale about power, betrayal, and the destruction that comes when those meant to protect become the ones to fear. The community in which this scandal unfolded was small enough that nothing escaped notice. In towns and farming villages across Arkansas, every arrival, every departure, every shift in behavior was observed and cataloged by neighbors whose lives were so interwoven that privacy was almost a foreign concept. And yet, when the father married his own son's bride, a strange silence fell across the people who should have been most outraged. They whispered yes, behind kitchen doors, in barns, and in the hushed corners of church gatherings, but few dared to speak aloud what they knew. It was as if the act itself was too monstrous to name, and to call it out would invite a kind of contamination. Better to swallow the discomfort, to let it rot quietly, than to confront a man powerful enough to make the entire town complicit in his betrayal. The church was the epicenter of community life. Every Sunday, families dressed in their best clothes walked or rode their wagons into town and sat together in pews beneath the stern gaze of their minister. In those pews, the forbidden marriage became the unspoken weight pressing on every hymn, every sermon. People avoided glancing toward the family for fear of being caught staring. Some said their voices shook as they sang, knowing that the woman standing beside the father should have been at the side of his son. Yet the preacher, who had officiated the union, gave no sermons condemning it. His silence became its own form of permission. If the church would not name it as sin, who among the congregation would dare? And so the hypocrisy spread, unspoken but palpable, corroding the very moral fabric the community prided itself on upholding. Behind closed doors, families argued. Some declared that what the father had done was unforgivable, a desecration of both family and faith. Others, more cautious, suggested that perhaps the woman had chosen freely, that perhaps it was not their place to intervene. The language of choice, however, was hollow in a society where a woman's future was dictated not by her will but by the authority of men around her. Even those who condemned the act did so in whispers, lowering their voices when the conversation strayed too close to outright accusation. Fear of reprisal kept them quiet. To speak openly against the patriarch was to risk more than social disapproval. It could mean being cut off from trade, from protection, from the fragile web of relationships that kept a family afloat in difficult times. Rumors began to seep into the fabric of everyday life. Some said the son had been seen walking the roads alone at night, his shoulders hunched, his eyes dark with humiliation. Others claimed the bride never lifted her gaze in public anymore, that she had become a ghost of herself, a silent figure trailing behind her new husband. The father, meanwhile, carried himself with the same rigid authority as before, unshaken by the whispers that curled like smoke around him. His presence alone was enough to silence tongues in public, though behind his back the murmurs grew louder with each passing week. The scandal reached beyond the family to touch the entire community's sense of identity. Respectability was not just an individual concern, it was collective. What one man did reflected on the town as a whole, and to have such a grotesque violation in their midst was a stain they could not wash away. Outsiders who passed through might hear fragments of the story, and that possibility frightened them. Reputation mattered. If their town became known as a place where such unions could happen unchallenged, what else might be said about them? And so the collective instinct was to bury it, to seal it beneath layers of silence, as though pretending it had never happened would protect them from the judgment of the wider world. Children, of course, were not blind. They heard their parents' arguments carried through thin walls, caught fragments of whispered gossip, and felt the tension in church pews. They learned early that there were things not to be spoken of, that certain truths were too dangerous to put into words. For them, the scandal became a lesson in the unspoken rules of survival. Do not question authority, do not speak against power, and do not expect justice when those rules are broken. These children grew up with the memory of the marriage not as an event, but as a shadow, something that lingered in the corners of their minds, shaping their understanding of what was possible and what must be endured. The silence was not absolute, however. There were moments when outrage broke through, when the hypocrisy of it all could no longer be contained. A neighbor might let slip a remark about the unnaturalness of the union, only to fall into uneasy silence when others shifted uncomfortably. A preacher's wife might be overheard lamenting what it meant for the younger generation to witness such a betrayal. These small cracks revealed the truth, that beneath the outward calm, the scandal festered like an infection, poisoning trust and eroding the moral certainty on which the community prided itself, and yet no one took action. The father was never dragged before a court, never publicly rebuked by the church elders. His authority, combined with the community's fear of shame, insulated him from consequences. This collective inaction was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all. It revealed not just the failure of one man to honor his duties, but the failure of an entire community to confront him. Their silence became complicity, their whispers a substitute for justice. Over time, the forbidden marriage became part of the town's folklore, though not in the way ordinary stories were told. It was not recounted openly at gatherings or used as a cautionary tale in sermons. Instead, it lived in fragments, half-remembered details traded in hushed tones, warnings passed to daughters about the dangers of misplaced trust, bitter jokes told by young men about the shame of losing everything to one's own father. The story was never whole, never spoken plainly, because to do so would force the community to confront its own cowardice. In this way, the reaction to the marriage revealed as much about the people as it did about the family at its center. They were trapped in a web of their own making, bound by fear of disgrace, fear of conflict, and fear of the very man whose actions demanded judgment. Their silence was not just the absence of words, it was the deliberate burying of truth, the choice to live with a festering wound rather than risk the upheaval of exposing it. And in that silence, the forbidden marriage was allowed not only to exist, but to define them, a secret so heavy it bent the entire community beneath its weight. In the rural society of 1888 Arkansas, the notion of family, kinship, and marriage was the very spine of communal life. Yet beneath that spine, there existed shadows that few dared to illuminate. Marriage was not simply a private union between two individuals, but an arrangement that touched economics, land, and reputation. A daughter's worth in many households was bound to her purity and her role in continuing the family line, while a son's pride was linked to his ability to provide, protect, and marry well. Within this delicate web, the story of a father seizing his son's intended bride became more than an act of betrayal. It was a seismic rupture in the cultural fabric of the time. It was an unspeakable transgression that turned neighbors into silent witnesses, left families shattered, and stirred fears that certain sins were too poisonous to name aloud. The young woman at the center of this scandal entered her engagement, believing she was stepping into a new life with a man her age, someone whose future was interwoven with her own. Courtship in the Ozarks was modest by nature. Whispered words exchanged after Sunday sermons, the silent approval of parents, and a handshake between men that solidified intent. But for her, what had seemed like a promise of stability suddenly spiraled into confusion and dread. The father of her fiancé, an older man marked by weathered hands, sharp eyes, and an authority that came not only from age but from ownership, began exerting an influence that could not be mistaken for paternal concern. His gaze lingered too long. His presence felt suffocating, and the whispers that followed her across the fields became impossible to ignore. For the son, the betrayal was a wound that reached deeper than jealousy or pride. He had grown under the weight of his father's shadow, working his land, following his commands, and enduring his temper. Yet in the prospect of marriage, he had finally seen a path that might carve out his independence. To take a wife was not just a matter of affection, but of manhood itself. And then, in an act that would have seemed unthinkable to any who still held to the bonds of morality, that path was stolen. The father's interest in his bride-to-be was not rumor but reality, and the house that should have held joy now throbbed with unholy tension. Neighbors, though unwilling to speak directly, sensed the rot beneath the surface. In the tightly bound communities of 19th century Arkansas, everyone's life was interlaced. One family's shame seeped into the reputation of another. But in matters this dark, Silence was often the chosen response. To accuse a father of coveting, much less stealing his son's bride, was to spit upon an entire family's name. Instead, gossip traveled in whispers, through hushed conversations at markets and murmurs during Sunday services. Some spoke of curses that befell those who crossed sacred boundaries, recalling old stories of blighted crops and children born with twisted limbs, in families where incest or forbidden unions had taken root. What makes this event particularly haunting is not only the act itself, but the way it stripped bare the fragile hierarchy within families. Fathers were revered as protectors and guides, figures meant to safeguard their households against sin and shame. To see one step so far outside his role was to shake the very core of communal trust. For the young woman, the horror was twofold. She was not only robbed of her chosen match, but ensnared in a web where resistance could mean ruin. In an era when a woman's reputation was currency, to be claimed by the wrong man, even against her will, was enough to destroy her future. The psychological toll must have been staggering. For the son, every glance at his father became a reminder of betrayal, not only of blood, but of destiny. The hearth no longer represented warmth, but deception. The land he worked no longer promised inheritance, but served as a symbol of everything he could never claim as his own. For the woman, every step through the small town would have been accompanied by the sting of eyes upon her, measuring her, judging her, condemning her to a fate she had never chosen. And for the father, though cloaked in authority, his actions carried a silent weight of paranoia, fear that the whispers might break into accusations, fear that his household could become a parable of corruption passed down for generations. As the months unfolded, the forbidden marriage became not only a private tragedy, but a lesson in the dangers of unchecked power. Communities in 1888 Arkansas often clung to Scripture as their compass, and this story was seen through that lens. An echo of Lot's daughters, of David and Bathsheba, of other tales where lust corroded sacred order. But unlike the stories in the Bible, which ended with divine punishment or redemption, here there was no clear resolution. The forbidden union lingered as a wound, poisoning relationships, driving wedges between neighbors, and sowing suspicion among kin. One can imagine the son leaving gatherings early, unable to stand the sight of his father seated beside the woman who should have been his wife. One can imagine the mother, if she still lived, racked with silent humiliation, her authority within the home undermined by her husband's violation of all boundaries. And one can imagine the young woman now trapped, carrying the burden of a community's judgment for something she could not prevent, her voice drowned beneath the weight of a patriarch's will. The true horror of the story lies not in the scandal itself, but in its implications, that within the very structures meant to protect family, the deepest betrayals can take root. That silence chosen as a shield can in fact serve as complicity. That history remembers not the daily kindness of neighbors or the hymns sung in small wooden churches, but the one act so vile that it stains the soil beneath it. And so, in 1888, Arkansas, the tale of a father stealing his son's bride did not merely exist as rumor, but as a symbol of forbidden transgressions, too monstrous to be fully spoken aloud, a shadow etched into the collective memory of a community that chose silence over truth. When the whispers of a forbidden marriage spread through the valleys and pine thickets of Arkansas in 1888, they did not vanish with the turn of seasons. Instead, they grew heavier, attaching themselves to every conversation, every lingering glance, every uncomfortable silence between neighbors. The scandal of a father stealing his son's bride was not the sort of story that could be neatly folded away and forgotten. It lingered because it spoke to something primal, the violation of natural order, the inversion of roles so essential to community survival. Where a father was supposed to shield, he consumed. Where a son was meant to inherit, he was stripped. And where a bride was supposed to be honored, she was reduced to a possession claimed by the strongest hand. The community carried the weight of this sin like a bruise beneath the skin. At church gatherings, the pews creaked with unspoken tension. When the father entered, heads turned, but eyes darted quickly away, as though acknowledging his presence too long might confirm complicity. The young man, robbed of his fiancée, endured the pity of those who avoided his gaze, their silence more wounding than their words might have been. His pain became a mirror no one wanted to confront, because to face it would mean acknowledging the monstrous betrayal that had taken root within their own ranks. What makes this episode so haunting is the way in which it blurred the boundaries between private sin and public shame. In rural 19th century life, family was community. Land, bloodlines, and marriages bound neighbors together, creating an intricate web where one household's downfall inevitably touched another's. If a man transgressed against his kin, he transgressed against everyone who had ever broken bread at his table, traded with him at market, or prayed beside him on Sundays. Yet no one dared act openly. There was a paralysis, a refusal to interfere, because to expose such darkness was to risk tearing apart the fragile threads of respectability that the community clung to. Behind closed doors, the atmosphere within the family must have been unbearable. Imagine the son, returning each day to the same cabin, forced to share meals under the same roof with the father who had taken what was his. Each glance across the table became a silent accusation, each moment of forced civility another layer of torment. The bride herself must have lived in a state of dissonance, bound by circumstances she could not control, yet judged as if she had chosen them. In her silence, there was likely desperation, an understanding that in her society, women bore the brunt of scandal while men, however guilty, often found ways to cloak themselves in authority or excuse. For the father, there was no redemption in his act, only a slow descent into paranoia. The gaze of neighbors carried judgment, whether spoken or not. His land, once a symbol of his control, became a prison of whispers. Every creak of the wind through the woods at night could have sounded like the voice of condemnation. Every failure of the crops, every illness in livestock, could have been read as divine punishment. Men of that time were not strangers to superstition. To betray one's blood so deeply was to invite not just earthly scandal but heavenly wrath. What strikes the modern observer most is the way silence functioned as a weapon. By not speaking, by not confronting, the community allowed the scandal to grow more monstrous in memory. Children overheard fragments and filled in the gaps with imagination. Strangers passing through were told veiled versions of the tale, stripped of names but heavy with implication. And as years went on, the story became a kind of curse, a warning told in low voices to remind others of the line that should never be crossed. The father, the son, the stolen bride, they became archetypes of sin, betrayal, and ruin. The psychological scarring extended far beyond the individuals involved. For the son, the theft of his bride was also the theft of his future. His chance to establish himself, to break free of his father's dominance, was crushed in an instant. How could he ever trust again, when the man who should have been his guide in life had become his rival? For the bride, even if she carried no blame, she bore the stain of the scandal in the eyes of society. Any children born of that union, if they came, would have carried an unspoken shadow, marked by gossip about their origins. The cycle of shame would not end with one generation. This is what made the event so corrosive: its endurance. It was not a single act that could be punished and then forgotten. It was a sin that echoed, reshaping relationships for decades. Neighbors who once worked together in harmony grew suspicious of one another. Women warned their daughters of dangers not from strangers, but from within families. Men looked at their own authority with unease, as though the story had revealed a rot that could, under the right conditions, erupt anywhere. The 1888 Arkansas scandal forces us to consider how power, when unchecked, becomes corruption. A father held near total control over his household, and with that control came opportunity for abuse. In seizing what was not his, he demonstrated not only cruelty, but the terrifying reality that those closest to us can become our undoing. And the community's silence, its unwillingness to intervene, demonstrated the cost of preserving reputation over truth. By burying the scandal, they allowed it to take root, ensuring it would never truly die. Even decades later, as the land changed hands and families moved on, the tale lingered in the soil. Old-timers told it around firesides as a dark reminder. Some claimed the land was cursed, pointing to the untimely deaths, the withering harvests, the misfortunes that seemed to cling to those tied to that family line. Others dismissed such talk, but still lowered their voices when recalling the father who took his son's bride. The details blurred over time, but the core of the story, the betrayal, the forbidden union, remained razor-sharp. The most disturbing truth is that this story is not an isolated anomaly. It is a reminder that history holds countless shadows, acts of betrayal and transgression buried beneath polite records and carefully written family Bibles. What survives are not always the names or exact dates, but the warnings, the echoes of scandal that refuse to fade. And in that refusal lies their power. The story of 1888 Arkansas endures because it forces us to confront what we would rather not see. That the deepest wounds are not always inflicted by strangers, but by those within our own homes, those we were taught to trust above all others. As the years stretched on from that winter of 1888, the story of the father who stole his son's bride became less an incident tied to one family and more a spectral presence that haunted the entire region. In a place like Arkansas, where memory was carried orally, not always written, stories transformed into warnings, layered with both truth and exaggeration until they seemed half legend. Yet at the heart of it, the scandal endured precisely because it spoke to fears that were universal. Betrayal within bloodlines, the collapse of moral order, the sense that home, the one place meant to offer shelter, could instead become the site of the most unspeakable violations. Children who had not even been born in 1888 grew up hearing fragments of the tale from hushed conversations at the dinner table or whispered warnings at night. Parents used the story as caution, telling daughters to be wary of men who carried themselves with too much authority, reminding sons that unchecked pride could turn a father into a rival. In these lessons, fact blurred with fable, but the seed of unease never disappeared. When a tale carries the weight of moral corruption, it becomes timeless, refusing to stay confined to the year it occurred. The young woman at the center of it all, though she aged and lived out her days, remained frozen in memory as the bride who had been stolen. Every action she took after the marriage was measured against that one act, as though her identity could never escape it. In the eyes of some, she was a victim to be pitied. In the eyes of others, she was complicit, a woman who had failed to resist. The cruelty of that judgment lay in its impossibility. There was no way for her to prove innocence in a society that rarely granted women the power to shape their own narratives. Her silence, whether born of fear or necessity, became the very canvas upon which others painted their suspicions. The son's fate carried its own tragedy. Betrayed by his father, stripped of his bride, he lived with a wound that never healed. Some claimed he left Arkansas entirely, disappearing into the western frontier to start a new life, far from the shadow of his family. Others insisted he stayed nearby, a broken man who drank too much and worked too little, his pride shattered, his sense of self stolen alongside the woman he was meant to marry. Whichever version held truth, the lesson remained the same. Betrayal from within destroys more than the present. It robs the future. For the father, history was merciless. Even if he maintained his household and land, even if he forced the community to acknowledge him in public as a man of standing, his name became inseparable from the scandal. He might have walked through town with his head high, but behind every closed door his story was told with disgust. Respect turned hollow. Authority became shadowed by unease. A man can plow fields, raise barns, and fill a church pew every Sunday. But once he crosses the forbidden boundary between protector and predator, no deed can wash away the stain. The true endurance of this scandal lay not only in its shocking details, but in what it revealed about silence. Communities like those in rural Arkansas often prided themselves on their unity, their ability to weather hardship together. Yet when faced with a sin too great to confront, they turned inward, sealing their lips rather than seeking justice. That silence did not erase the wrong, it preserved it. Each generation inherited the shame, carrying it like an heirloom of shadows. In this way, the father's act reached far beyond the confines of his home, infecting the moral fabric of an entire county. Some would later describe strange happenings around the land once owned by the family. Livestock that refused to graze near certain fields, marriages that ended in bitter estrangement, children who grew up fearful of their fathers without knowing why. Whether superstition or coincidence, the perception of a curse clung stubbornly. People wanted to believe that nature itself rebelled against the violation, that the earth would not allow such betrayal to pass without consequence. These beliefs gave shape to the community's unease, transforming one man's sin into a haunting that seemed to seep into the soil. The scandal also forced broader questions about the vulnerability of women in that era. With little legal recourse, bound by reputation and dependent on male authority, A young bride could be claimed, abandoned, or destroyed, with minimal consequence to the man who wronged her. The story became a reminder of that imbalance, an unspoken acknowledgement that beneath the veneer of order and morality, women often bore the heaviest costs of men's sins. It was not only a father's betrayal of his son, but a patriarch's betrayal of the very role he was meant to uphold, to protect rather than consume. What made the story so disturbing was its permanence. Unlike fleeting feuds or forgotten quarrels, this scandal could never be erased because it touched the core of human fear. That those closest to us, those we depend on most, are capable of the deepest harm. It became not just a story about Arkansas in 1888, but a parable about family, power, and silence that could be applied anywhere, in any time. The details might shift in retelling, but the essence remained. Betrayal destroys not only trust, but the very foundation upon which communities are built. By the time the century turned and new generations took root, the names involved may have grown faint, blurred by time, but the warning endured. To speak of a stolen bride in hushed tones was enough to conjure the entire tale. The father's sin, the son's grief, the bride's entrapment, these became archetypes, figures that haunted the imagination as vividly as any ghost story. And in a way, they were ghosts, not spirits of the dead, but echoes of choices that could never be undone. The story's endurance, its ability to pass from memory into myth, reveals how communities process the unbearable. They do not forget. They reshape. They recast. They whisper. And through those whispers, the wound is carried forward, a reminder of the line that, once crossed, cannot be mended. In the end, the 1888 scandal was not buried at all. It lived on, not in official records, but in the uneasy silence of Sunday gatherings, in the cautionary tales told to children, in the shiver that passed through the air whenever someone recalled the father who stole his own son's bride. As you've just heard, the chilling story of the father who betrayed his own blood in 1888. Arkansas is not just a piece of forgotten history, it's a haunting reminder of how darkness can grow within the very heart of family and community. These are the kinds of stories history books often bury, the tales that live only in whispers, and yet they hold truths that refuse to die. If this story made you pause, if it left you unsettled, or if it opened your eyes to a side of history that feels almost too disturbing to believe, then this is exactly the place for you. On this channel, we bring forward the forbidden, the hidden, and the stories that were never meant to be told. Every week, we peel back another layer of the past, uncovering scandals, betrayals, mysteries, and dark events that shape the world in ways most people never realize. But I don't just want you to watch. I want you to be part of this journey. So take a moment right now, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next descent into history's shadows. And I want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this scandal? Was it pure evil, or was it the product of a society that enabled silence? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and your perspective helps bring these stories to life. Together, let's keep unearthing the truths history tried to hide.